Today, we're going to discuss the historical and secular accounts of Jesus that are outside of the Bible. We're going to look at how corroborating accounts and the validity of a particular document, letter, or other piece of literature is done. In other words, before the intellectual community, scientists, or even in a court of law accept something as a fact, it must be corroborated. In other words, evidence. If someone is going to convict another individual of a crime, they must get evidence. And evidence comes in many different forms. You have physical evidence, you have testimonials, eyewitness testimonies. Right now, DNA is one of the hot issues in the criminal justice system. I've heard a commercial and an advertisement by a law enforcement official that stated plainly that if you commit a crime, we will catch you. This statement is based on, or the statement that this individual made comes from the new and improved collection methods and testing and research that is being done in the field of DNA recognition. Now, what does all of this information, the DNA, evidence, physical evidence, testimonies, history, has to do with the truth? Well, evidence is like paint on a canvas. When a picture is not clear, especially of a historical accounts where we cannot go back into time and actually be there and interview eyewitnesses, we have to use these fragmented pieces of evidence to determine what the picture is. We can see a few little flecks of paint in the historical writings and the archaeological remains of a particular place and time in history to determine what was going on during that time. Now, the first stroke of paint that I will begin with starts with Pliny the Younger. He was the Roman governor of Bithynia, otherwise, or rather what we would know as modern Turkey, under the emperorship of Trajan. Pliny the Younger is traditionally accounted to be in the governorship between 111 and 113 AD. And it is during this period that the governor wrote letters to his emperor Trajan concerning the prosecution of Christians. Now, Pliny the Younger has written many letters. He was alive during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, and 247 of his letters concerning a variety of topics during his life survive today. The letters that we want to focus on, however, deal with his correspondence with Emperor Trajan concerning passing sentences on people who claim to be Christians roughly 100 years after the death of Christ. The issue that Pliny describes in his letter concerns passing sentences on individuals who claim to be Christian and who do not worship the statues and images of the Roman gods, and in particular, the emperor. Pliny states that he has passed, or rather used, the death sentence, capital punishment, on some Christians, and he's asking the emperor, is this appropriate? Furthermore, in his letter, he says what he has learned of the Christian religion is that, and I will quote, "They affirmed, however, the whole of their guilt or their error was that they were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but to never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind." Pliny in his letter describes the ordinary processes that occur in many Christian churches around the world today, coming together, singing hymns, and the Eucharistic celebration, all centered around Christ. Now, what does the Pliny letter prove? Well, for one thing, it doesn't independently prove or give an eyewitness to Jesus Christ. But what it does prove is that Christians, generally 100 of years after the death of Christ, were actively practicing Christianity and a form of Christianity that we know today under the penalty of capital punishment. The governor Pliny was putting Christians to death, or people who claim to be Christians to death, simply because of their faith. Now, the Pliny letter does say that some people would recant their allegiance to Christianity under questioning and under the penalty, or being pressed with the penalty of capital punishment. Detractors of what the Pliny letters prove use this as evidence that Christianity was fake, that people would recant under penalty of capital punishment. I do not hold on to this interpretation of the evidence presented in the Pliny letters, because just as many people that recanted their faith were people that held on to their faith, that went through the capital punishment simply because they were Christians. The trials and the interrogations that Pliny, the governor of Turkey, was holding were based solely on Christianity and people being Christians. So what we have thus far with the Pliny letters is, with one stroke, a picture or a swath of paint that Christians were being persecuted and put to death for their faith in Christ. Next, we're going to go to Tacitus, or Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian, who was writing also about 100 years, 115 AD, about the fires in Rome in 64 AD. And specifically, he writes about how Nero prosecuted the Christians in order to draw attention away from the fires in Rome. The issue at hand, and the issue that this Roman historian is writing about, is that the accusations that Nero started the fire. And in an attempt to displace the blame, Nero prosecuted the Christians. So in a passing reference to explain what the Christians are, the Roman historian Tacitus wrote, hence, to suppress the rumor, he falsely charged with the guilt and punished Christians who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. But the pernicious superstition, repressed for a time, broke out again, not only through Judea, where the mischief originated, but through the city of Rome also, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Here again, we see a respected Roman historian writing, or rather providing information in a tangential manner about Christians during the time of the fires in Rome at 64 AD, and the sect of Christians who followed Christ, who was put to death by Pontius Pilate, a procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius. Some of the most important points that are brought forth in this historical account by Tacitus is that the followers were known as Christians. Their leader was Christ, who was put to death by Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, which was AD 14 through 37. The debate around the information presented in this letter by Tacitus, or rather this historical account by the historian Tacitus, lies in the source of his information. Tacitus was not an eyewitness to the crucifixion, nor was he, or does he, purport himself to be in Judea during the time of the occurrence of the crucifixion that he writes about. So, some scholars want to say, or rather make the point that he is getting his information from unreliable sources. Since he was not an eyewitness, he's only recounting what he was told, and those that told him the account of Pontius Pilate and Christ and Christians were unreliable. Now, mind you, we're only writing, let's say, 60 or 70 years, or Tacitus is only writing 60 or 70 years after the crucifixion of Christ. Furthermore, the information that he provides about Pontius Pilate and the Roman Emperor Tiberius, and that the movement was founded in Judea, and also, well, we can leave out the crucifixion, but all of that information is verifiable and historical, absent of rumors. It would be easy for a respected historian to look into the government records and see that, yes, indeed, Pontius Pilate was the procurator of Judea during this time period, and the Emperor Tiberius was also ruling during the time in question.
Some purported scholars only argue that while Pontius Pilate and the Roman Emperor Tiberius is fact, it is interspersed with fantasy and myth of Christianity and Christ and the crucifixion in this particular historical account. What we do know is from the Pliny letters and this Tacitus account is that whether myth or fable, that this individual Christ was crucified by Pontius Pilate in Judea, and that the followers of Christ worship on a day of the week, singing hymns, and are willing to die for their faith in the face of capital punishment. No more than 40 or 50 years or even less after the purported crucifixion of Christ. Or we could even say 70 years after the crucifixion of Christ. So there would be eyewitnesses still alive during this 70-year period that could corroborate or refute with certainty this Christian superstition, as some would claim. Another Roman historian, Suetonius, writes about the persecution of Christians in Rome and Christians being expelled under edict of the Roman ruler Claudius. It states, in the life of Claudius, we find the statement, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from Rome. Suetonius also makes mention of the persecution of Nero, which was experienced by the Christians. It states punishment by Nero was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. We have to take a look at the fire in Rome of 64 AD and the reign of Pontius Pilate, which was between 26 and 36 AD. And also the reign of the Emperor Tiberius from 14 to 37 AD. If we look at the end of Tiberius and Pilate's reign around 36 and 37 AD, and the fire in Rome of 64 AD, that is less than 30 years between the two occurrences. If we account for the 10 years that Pontius Pilate reigned from 26 to 36, and we add another 10 years, that's 40 years for the supposed crucifixion of Christ to have occurred, it seems highly likely that there were still eyewitnesses to the crucifixion alive during the period on which these historians are writing about. Some biblical scholars tend to tie the account mentioned in the Suetonius writings with Acts 18:2, when Paul met Aquila and Priscilla, who were fleeing from Rome. The next account that I'll bring up is Celsus. Celsus was a philosopher of his day, and his writings occurred around the late 2nd century, 170 AD. And his writings was a philosophical attack against Christianity. Now, Celsus' writings don't exist, and we only learn of Celsus' writings in a critique and response to his attack on Christianity from another philosopher named Origen. Origen felt it prudent to respond to the works of his fellow Platonist philosopher, Celsus. So in Origen's response to Celsus, he first lists what Celsus wrote. In a point-by-point matter, Origen states, well, Celsus states this, but then I respond with this. What we learn from Celsus' writings is this, that he was the illegitimate son born by Mary, that Jesus went to Egypt, and that Christ was killed and resurrected. And Celsus describes the resurrection as the misunderstanding of reincarnation. Celsus describes all of these things about Jesus in a manner to philosophically dissect them and disprove them. Celsus points out that Christians would not worship Zeus because his tomb was right there in plain sight in Crete, yet their god was supposedly resurrected from his tomb. I find it fascinating that a respected philosopher would have to resort to rationalizing between Zeus and Christ rather than just state the fact that Christ didn't rise because of the plain evidence of the day. It is very interesting that this respected philosopher needed to use rationalization rather than facts to disprove Christianity only 140 years after the purported crucifixion of Christ. The information that we have from Origen and Celsus does not provide an eyewitness testimony, but it also does not refute emphatically and evidentially the Christian tradition that was being practiced with fervor during that time period. Now, mind you, we are only 140 to 150 years after the events of Christ. And the accounts, the verified historical accounts that I've presented thus far narrow that timeline down from 150 down to less than 40 or 30 years after the events of Christ. There are other references to Jesus in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a historic Jewish and rabbinical document by Lucian, a great satirist, between 120 and 180 AD, and Thallus, another historian that writes about the darkness surrounding the crucifixion of Christ, the purported 6th to the 9th hour darkness that occurred on the day Jesus was crucified. Thallus is referenced in the writing of Africanus to have been an eyewitness to this occurrence. Africanus references to Thallus' eyewitness account is also supported in the writings of Josephus, another Jewish and rabbinical historian. All of the accounts, and there are many more that I've mentioned thus far, are corroborated through other sources and the Bible. What we don't find in the historical records and archaeological evidence is any clear disproof of what the Bible represents as the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The early Christian church may have been small, but its members reached all across the territories of Rome. And the activities of Christians and the knowledge of Christ was spread to many regions within Rome, as is evidenced by the writings of Roman governors, emperors, historians, and philosophers. The writings that survive today narrow the buzz around Jesus Christ and Christians into a period of less than 30 years after the death of Jesus Christ. The historical records record and reveal that people were practicing Christianity under the penalty of persecution and even capital punishment during this early church time period. What the historical record that we have today does not reveal is that Christianity and the Christian message was fake or unsubstantiated. Was there not one person or one shred of evidence to the contrary that the ruling authorities of the Roman Empire could use to refute and quash the rebellion or the perceived insurrection from people that did not want to worship the Roman gods, but in fact worship the true and living God through Jesus Christ? I will agree that the surviving historical documents outside of the Bible do not implicitly reveal an eyewitness to or the proverbial smoking gun about Christianity, but the evidence is clear and it leads to only one conclusion. And the conclusion is that the events, the biblical account of the life and death of Jesus Christ is verifiable and true. The common men and women that were practicing Christianity no less than 20, 30, or 40 years after the events of Christ were willing to risk their life for not a rumor, but for the truth. If there was clear evidence against the person of Jesus Christ and the biblical account of Jesus Christ, that evidence would be documented alongside of these historical accounts about Christianity. There is no shred of evidence against the person of Jesus Christ and the historical authenticity of Christ represented in the Bible. In fact, the historical documents and artifacts corroborate the Bible and the life and times of Jesus Christ. Any individual that is seriously considering the message and the gospel message of Jesus Christ can look at the evidence that is outside of the Bible and decide for themselves. Now, there are a few individuals who claim to be scholars that refute point by point each historical piece of evidence outside of the Bible that mentions Christ. Most of their claims are centered around the fact that the piece of evidence is not in and of itself an independent confirmation of Jesus. Scholars, or rather so-called scholars, that use this type of terminology of independent confirmation for one piece of evidence, in my opinion, are not doing, or rather performing, a honest evaluation of historical evidence. At this time, there is no one piece of evidence in and of itself. There is no one smoking gun that confirms Jesus Christ as far as it pertains to secular historical evidence outside of the Bible. However, there are breadcrumbs, and the artifacts and documents that we have in our possession concerning history paint a picture of what life was like in the past. And as an individual starts to put all of the historical, non-biblical evidence about Jesus Christ into a coherent and consistent view, the only conclusion leads to the fact that Jesus Christ indeed existed in history and performed and lived his life according to the biblical account. This is the honest conclusion that the majority of scholars, both biblical and secular, come up with when they evaluate the historical evidence that we have concerning Jesus Christ.